My First Million is a podcast brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. It is one of my favourite business and marketing podcasts, and I think you'll like it too. It features famous guests like Gary Vee, Steph Smith, and Peter Levels, and shares their secrets for how they made their first million and how you can apply their learnings to capitalise on today's business trends. So go and listen to My First Million wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, I'm Phil Agnew and you are listening to the Nudge podcast. On this show, as many of you know, we look at behavioural science and see how it can be applied to marketing. But regularly, usually once a month, I get asked about something else. Instead of applying behavioural science to marketing, many of you get in touch wanting to know about applying behavioural science at work. Now, most of you listening to this will work in an organisation, and many of you are keen to figure out how to become more productive, to be a better manager, and to improve the decisions you make. Well, behavioural science can help with all of these things. In this episode, we'll cover how behavioural science can be applied in the workplace. You'll hear studies which showcase the problem with overconfidence, the best ways to seek advice, and how to give feedback. I'll share snippets from the behavioural science expert and best-selling author Steve Martin, and you'll hear from Bruce Daisley, former VP at Twitter and host of the Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat podcast. But let's start with an important question. How can you make better decisions at work? Octavius Black is CEO at MindGym, one of the UK's largest behavioural science agencies. They've helped over half the FTSE 100 and the S&P 100 apply behavioural science at work. On a recent BBC4 radio show, Octavius shared a study which caught my attention. This study analysed the performances of companies after a change of CEO. It reviewed hundreds of companies' market cap, essentially their stock market performance, and looked for trends. And something interesting appears. In general, the companies with new CEOs do see an increase, an improvement in performance. Usually this happens about 5 to 7 years after the CEO starts. That's when the performance peaks. But then the performance starts to drop. So CEOs start in a new role, they tend to improve things, peaking, but then performance drops off. And this is consistent across lots of different industries and companies. And MindGym has a hypothesis that this is in part due to the confirmation bias. Now, all of us struggle with the confirmation bias. It's the idea that we seek information that matches our worldview. But when a new CEO starts, they do their best to counter the confirmation bias. They'll seek opinions from a diverse range of internal and external sources, which of course helps them make better decisions and boosts the performance of the company. But later on, the problems start. Once we start hitting targets, we get a bit complacent and we get a bit overconfident. And that desire to seek a diverse range of opinions, well, it fades. Instead, we fall back into getting advice from the trusted sources and the performance of the company drops. The confirmation bias affects us all, especially when we're overconfident. And overconfidence is something all of us in organizations need to be aware of. Studies show that the more senior you become, the more likely you are to fall foul of overconfidence. Individuals tend to overweight the probability of success in almost every business endeavour, and this overconfidence only becomes more prominent with success. This bias towards overconfidence is so prevalent that Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning author of Thinking Fast and Slow, said that if he could eliminate one bias with a magic wand, he'd pick overconfidence. So how do we avoid overconfidence in the workplace? Can we use Kahneman's magic wand to eradicate it? Well, Professor David Halpern, CEO at the Behavioural Insights team, shares a solution. In his book, Inside the Nudge Unit, he states that one way of overcoming overconfidence is by asking for feedback from a group rather than an individual. He shares studies that show when a group of people are asked to assess whether a project will succeed on schedule, their combined views tended to be far more accurate. The group consensus filters out individuals' overconfidence. At Hotjar, where I worked on the product marketing team, we applied this principle to our hiring process. Rather than taking it in turns to share what we thought about a job candidate after an interview, which when you take turns like that would inevitably cause whoever went first to bias everybody else, we would instead score each candidate in private and then share our scores at the same time. This process led to some interesting situations. Sometimes our scores for a candidate would be very similar, but at other times they'd be wildly different, with some of us saying we should definitely hire this person, with others saying that we absolutely should not. Gauging the consensus of the group helped us take all of our views into account, all of our unbiased, unfiltered views, and this ultimately improves the hiring process. By taking the group view, we removed overconfidence from the process. Creating great customer experience starts with having a full picture. And having a full picture starts with having teams that are connected. HubSpot is, I think, the best platform out there for helping your teams feel more connected. The HubSpot CRM platform is carefully crafted from the ground up, designed to unite your data, apps, and teams in a single, easy-to-use system. So instead of wasting valuable time tracking down information, your teams can spend their time having conversations where it matters most, with your customers. Learn how HubSpot can help your business grow better at HubSpot.com. I'm a bit of a productivity nut. I'm constantly looking to read, watch, and listen to anything that will help me improve my productivity. I can't help myself. I'm on this never-ending mission to optimize my work, and I probably spend more time watching videos on productivity than I actually do being productive. See, I think most of us really want to be more productive, and so I've often wondered, does behavioural science offer an answer? Well, it sort of does. David Halpern, who I referenced earlier, he spent a lot of time analysing workplace productivity and exploring how different incentives boost or hamper productivity. One finding, which we've spoken about before on the show, is that financial incentives don't tend to be very effective. They tend to have a great short-term boost, making individuals perform better for a few weeks, but those improvements decay quickly. The boost doesn't last. So David and his team tested a number of different other incentives, ranging from quadrupling the pay to removing incentives entirely. The results they uncovered were surprising, to say the least. It turns out employees are most incentivized by something Halpern calls social incentives. Essentially, you give an employee a small financial bonus, say £100 or £200, but you tell them that half of that incentive has to be gifted to a colleague. So essentially, you get a much smaller financial incentive than you would have usually, and you have to give half away. It really doesn't sound like it should work, and yet it does. This incentive was far more likely to boost productivity for a longer period of time than a much greater financial incentive. The Behavioural Insights team gave a couple of reasons why. Here's the first reason. See, asking someone to share their incentive meant that employees had to be constantly on the lookout for other highly productive colleagues to decide who to gift their incentive to. This helped build a culture of high performance where everybody in the business is trying to be more productive. The second reason was simple. It generally feels much better to give away money than it does to gain the equivalent amount. We get an irrational glow from giving away cash, which people treasure, so they work harder to get that same reward again. It's a classic example of how often the irrational approach tends to beat the rational one. Here's another example of the irrational biases we have in the workplace. It's from Steve Martin, New York Times bestseller and CEO of Influence at Work, and he explains how managers who say yes to every task often look less productive than their peers.
So this is a set of studies that was led by Frank Flynn, a US-based researcher, who conducted an analysis of middle to senior managers in a large telecoms organization. And here's what he found. He found that those managers who proactively gave to others, looked for ways to help colleagues, other departments to cooperate and to collaborate, were not only more liked, by those colleagues and those other departments, but they were considered more productive as well. And that will surprise no one at all, because that's how the rule works. We've come to recognize that. There's no surprise there. What's surprising about Frank's research is that there was another set of managers who did exactly the same thing. They looked for ways to help others, both individuals within their teams and cross departments, by giving of information, cooperating, collaborating. And they were considered the least productive managers in the organization. Now, this is the surprise now, is that how can one group of managers who are doing one thing be rated as much more productive, and there's another group who are doing exactly the same thing that aren't? And it turns out that it's the way in which they recognize and value the help that they do give to others. So the less productive managers were the kind of people in the organization that would respond to every request. They'd say yes to everything. They'd help others out. People really liked them. This is could always rely on Phil. You go to him for help, he'll always help you, etc. But then they threw away their moment of collaboration, of that exchange, their colleagues would say to them, thanks very much, Phil. And Phil would say, no problem at all, happy to help. And what they found was that they ended up spending so much of their time helping others and not asking for help themselves, that led to their unproductiveness in the organization. Whereas the managers that were much more productive, they helped in equal measure, but when they gave help, they arranged for that help that they were providing to others, other departments, other colleagues, to be seen as and signaled as, this is something we do for each other. This is part of an exchange mechanism we have in this organization. I'm doing this because I know that, if the situation was reversed, you'd probably do the same for me. This is what we expect of each other. Or perhaps they would look for ways to give that obligation forward. Our department is very happy to help your department. And in fact, actually, there's a couple of my members in my team that would really appreciate some insights or advice from you. And those aspects of give and take, they never ended. They were on this kind of cycle of exchange. And that's what Frank Flynn found to be the differentiating factor between those groups of managers. Those were much more productive. They didn't give less. They didn't use the principle of reciprocity less, or limit their use of it to groups that they just wanted to influence and persuade. What they did was they signaled that it was done in the context of an exchange mechanism that everybody signed up to and that everyone would benefit from. And that was the key difference.
So managers who offer to collaborate are more liked and considered more productive. Now that's not a surprise. But managers that look to help others but don't ask for anything in return, they're actually seen as less productive, spending so much of their time helping others while not asking for help themselves made these managers seem much less productive than their peers. Here's Steve explaining how you can apply this finding.
I'd go one stage further and actually suggest that in certain circumstances, if we are too willing to help others, if we give away too many things to others, we serve to damage the relationship with those others as well. Now, that's kind of interesting. There's certainly work in the field of sociology that finds that, in family groups, if there's one or two parties that do more for the unit than everyone else, that's a context for resentment. And there's an irony there. Those that are giving freely of their time and their assistance actually end up serving to resent those that they're actually giving to. It will often cause breakdowns in relationship. And I can see that a similar thing might actually happen in an organization as well, particularly when that exchange doesn't happen in an instant. You do another department or a colleague a favor. You don't do it because you can then immediately ask them to help you out. Right, I've done this for you, Phil, now you owe me. That's not the right thing at all. But it might be in a couple of months' time that, you get an opportunity to help me, and you may just simply have forgotten about what happened 2 months ago. It's very easy to actually forget what happened 2 days ago, or sometimes even 2 hours ago, such is the speed in which our world is operating now. So those mechanisms of exchange and mutual exchange between individuals and groups and departments are vitally important, not just for the productiveness of the organization, but for the health and the relationship aspect of the organization as well.
If we offer too much support to others without asking for anything in return, it can apparently damage relationships within an organisation. As Steve puts it, mutual exchange is vital for the health of an organisation. To be honest, I've never considered this before, and I have been a bit of a yes man at previous companies where I've worked. I've quickly agreed to everything and never really asked for much in return. And I can see firsthand the problems this caused. It made me less productive as I was constantly context switching, and probably made others think that I was a handy teammate rather than a trusted peer. Another thing I've struggled at work is giving critical feedback. I hate telling people about something they've done wrong. I just find it so tough to do. And yet, all the evidence out there tells us that giving critical feedback is vital for high-performing teams. So, can behavioural science help? Is there a way to give critical feedback without demotivating your teammates? Well, David Halpern has a solution. And surprisingly, this solution doesn't come from organisational studies, but from research into marriages. Psychologists for decades have analysed what makes a marriage more likely to succeed. And one of the best predictors of a successful marriage is something called the complement ratio. Now, this is the ratio of positive to negative remarks that you say or someone says about their spouse. Now, the magic number that the best marriages seem to have is a 5-to-1 positive to negative remarks ratio. In other words, for every negative thing you say to your spouse, you should be backing it up with at least 5 positive comments. Now, obviously, this shouldn't be used as a superficial tactic. You should genuinely mean the positive things you say, and it shouldn't be used as an excuse for a free dig at your partner if you've complimented them a lot already. No, instead, it's a clear trend that successful managers seem to share 5 positive compliments for 1 constructive comment. And David Halpern suggests that the same ratio applies to workplaces. See, study after study show that the best managers are managers who double down on positive feedback following that 5-to-1 ratio. The managers that don't, the ones that only highlight negative things, or perhaps just do a 50-50 split of positive to negative comments, well, these managers encounter problems, usually because their relationship takes this sort of downward spiral and starts to break apart. The thing is, we're just not wired to accept endless negative feedback. We need positive recognition to get by. Here's Bruce Daisley, the author of the best-selling book Joy of Work, the UK's best-selling business hardback book of 2019. Here's him explaining this phenomenon.
There's a strange thing when it comes to assessing the impact of bosses. Nothing has more impact on our experience of work than bosses. A friend of mine, Professor Sir Carrie Cooper, he often describes it as the line manager lottery. He says, people generally resign from a bad boss rather than a bad company. 2 teams sitting next to each other can have completely different workplace engagement scores simply based on their manager. So it seems to have a massive impact on our experience. But the one thing that we know that if you can't be a good boss, then being a good supportive colleague is the next best thing. And the power of praise is remarkable. In fact, when we look at bosses who see themselves as Simon Cowell style figures, sort of critical and analytical, they seem to produce much less impact in lifting their team's results upwards than people who just act as a selective cheerleader, calling things out when things go wrong. In fact, this doesn't just extend to work. This extends to personal relationships. People generally feel happier about their relationship when they feel their partner loves them, admires them, supports them. It's more than anything. It's that sense of belongingness. I think, human beings are sort of atavistically programmed to hate rejection, and anything that redoubles our sense of feeling wanted, belonging, seems in the very least to be helpful. So I think this is it. It's an important reminder to bosses. We might see avenues to be critical. I think we just need to be really clear about when to be critical and how we can get the most out of that. If you can't necessarily be the best manager, be the biggest supporter, seems to be a lesson.
Research consistently shows that praise improves performance. Studies find that managers who only praise create better performing employees, even if they fail to highlight clear flaws in the employee's performance. A study in the US and Spain found managers who communicated motivationally were more effective than those who offered financial rewards. And in contrast, that pure negative feedback, well, if you do that, it left teams feeling confused, disengaged, and more likely to quit, according to a 2015 Harvard Business Review paper. Praise is even more valuable when it comes from someone who knows what they're talking about. Now, you could summarize all of this by saying, being nice makes you a good manager. Now, I think it's more nuanced than that, but the research shows that plain and simple nice gestures greatly improve performance. And at the very least, following that 5-to-1 ratio seems like a solid place to start. Because being complimented seems to boost performance in all sorts of areas, not just the workplace. So, for example, doctors who receive a bag of sweets from their patients as a compliment are actually far better at coming up with a creative solution to a problem at hand. But we all know that negative feedback is necessary. We can't blindly praise an employee if they're doing something that's blatantly wrong. So what should we do in this scenario? Well, according to Octavius Black, the Mind Gym CEO who I mentioned earlier, a lot of feedback isn't helpful at all. In the BBC4 radio episode, which I've linked to in my show notes, he shares that 52% of feedback improves performance, but 33% actually makes performance worse, and 15% has no effect whatsoever. So almost half of all feedback given is useless. It's either making things worse or just not having an effect. This is a real shame because most of us, like me, struggle to pluck up the courage to give feedback in the first place. It's hard to do. And hearing that only half of it is useful is just disheartening. But there is a behavioural science solution. Octavius Black shares research that has looked at effective feedback. Studies have shown that the best type of feedback, the feedback that's most likely to improve performance, has a common trait. It's descriptive. Descriptive feedback tends to improve performance. So instead of saying something general, like, I don't think you're good with research, or I think you're very organised, you should aim to be descriptive. So you should say something like, I'd like you to add a source for your charts, or I love how you arrive on time to every meeting. Studies show that this type of feedback, this descriptive feedback, boosts productivity and improves performance. So when you pluck up the courage to offer that little bit of negative feedback after hopefully 5 compliments, make sure it's descriptive. Okay, folks, that is all for today. I really hope you've enjoyed today's show. I know heaps of you have been in touch to ask to do a show specifically on applying behavioural science in the workplace, so I hope you enjoyed this. There were 3 sources that I relied on to make this show. The first is Bruce Daisley's brilliant book, Joy of Work. It's an incredible resource explaining how to improve your experience at work. I've left a link to that book in the show notes, so check that out. I've also left a link to the episode that he did on Nudge, so go back and listen to that if you haven't already. I also went back and re-listened to some of the very, very early Nudge episodes with Steve Martin. He shared heaps of fascinating findings on the small things you can change in your workplace that have a big impact on performance. So if you want to listen to those shows that he did on Nudge, check out the links in the show notes as well. And then finally, I got a lot of inspiration from the BBC Radio 4 show Bottom Line. Their episode on behavioural science helped source a lot of the content I've shared in the show, and I've left a link to that in the show notes as well. Now, selfishly, I kind of hope this episode, which is talking a lot about feedback, has inspired you to leave some feedback of your own and perhaps some feedback for me and this podcast. So if you fancy leaving a bit of feedback, you can do so by leaving a review of Nudge if you listen on Apple or Spotify. I read every single review and I appreciate every single one, positive or negative. Hopefully they've got that 5-to-1 positive ratio, but I really do appreciate them all. So please do leave a review on there and let me know what you think. Or if you want to email me and share your thoughts privately, you can do so. You can email me. I'm phil@nudgepodcast.com. That's phil@nudgepodcast.com. But the Phil is with 2 L's, not 1. And I'm on Twitter. I'm P_Agnew, AGNEW. So you can give me a follow on there and let me know what you thought of this show. And you can also let me know, have you applied these approaches? Have any of them worked for you? I would love to hear and I'd love for you to get in touch. All right. Well, thanks again for listening to today's episode of Nudge. Cheers.